In the winter of 1513, Niccolò Machiavelli sat in exile on his small farm outside Florence, stripped of his political position, his influence, and nearly everything he had worked to build. The republic he had served faithfully had fallen, the Medici had returned to power, and he found himself accused of conspiracy, tortured, and cast aside like a discarded tool. Yet it was in this moment of apparent defeat that Machiavelli discovered a profound truth that would reshape not only his understanding of power but the very foundation of political thought for centuries to come. As he watched the flames dance in his modest fireplace, warming his hands against the bitter cold, Machiavelli realized that his greatest weakness had not been his political miscalculations or his loyalty to a fallen regime. His greatest weakness had been his attachment to position, to approval, to the very identity he had constructed around his role in the Florentine government. The pain he felt was not merely the sting of political defeat, it was the agony of a man who had allowed external circumstances to define his sense of self-worth. It was in this crucible of loss that the seeds of true power began to germinate. Machiavelli understood that as long as he remained emotionally invested in outcomes beyond his control, as long as he needed the approval of others to feel whole, as long as he identified himself with temporary roles and positions, he would forever be vulnerable to the whims of fortune. The man who could be destroyed by the loss of external things was, in essence, already destroyed, he simply hadn't realized it yet. This realization marked the beginning of what would become one of history's most profound explorations of power, control, and human nature. But, unlike the common interpretation of Machiavelli's work as a cynical manual for manipulation, the true lesson embedded within his observations was far more revolutionary. The path to unshakable power begins not with controlling others, but with liberating oneself from the need for their validation, their resources, or their approval. The concept of detachment, as Machiavelli came to understand it, was not about becoming cold or indifferent to the world. Instead, it was about recognizing the fundamental distinction between what is within our control and what is not, and then systematically withdrawing our sense of self-worth, our emotional stability, and our strategic planning from dependence on factors beyond our influence. This detachment creates a kind of invulnerability that no external force can penetrate, because it eliminates the very targets that enemies typically aim for. Consider the traditional vulnerabilities that most people carry through life, like open wounds, the desperate need for social approval that makes them modify their behavior to please others, the attachment to material possessions that creates anxiety about loss, the identification with titles and roles that crumbles when circumstances change, the emotional dependence on relationships that gives others the power to manipulate through withdrawal of affection. Each of these attachments represents a lever that others can pull to control our actions, emotions, and decisions. The person who craves approval will compromise their principles to maintain popularity. The person who fears financial loss will accept unfavorable terms rather than risk their comfortable position. The person whose identity depends on their professional title will sacrifice their integrity to preserve their status. The person who cannot bear emotional isolation will tolerate abuse rather than face solitude. In each case, the attachment creates the vulnerability, and the vulnerability becomes the pathway through which external forces exercise control over our internal state. Machiavelli's genius lay in recognizing that this dynamic could be reversed. By systematically identifying and dissolving these attachments, by building an internal foundation that required nothing external for its stability, a person could achieve a form of power that was literally unassailable. Not because they were stronger or more skilled than their opponents, but because they had eliminated the very mechanisms through which others typically exert influence. This process of detachment begins with a ruthless inventory of our current dependencies. What do we need from others to feel confident? What external circumstances must align for us to feel secure? What losses would devastate us emotionally? What forms of criticism or rejection affect our behavior? Each honest answer reveals another chain that binds us to the whims of forces beyond our control. The executive who needs constant praise from superiors to feel confident in their decisions is operating from a position of fundamental weakness, regardless of their apparent authority. Their decision-making process is corrupted by the need to maintain approval, leading them to choose safe, popular options over optimal ones. They become predictable, and, therefore controllable, because others understand that the withdrawal of approval is all that's needed to influence their behavior. Contrast this with an executive who has developed genuine detachment from external validation. They gather input from others not because they need approval, but because diverse perspectives improve decision quality. They consider the political implications of their choices not because they fear disapproval, but because understanding the landscape leads to better strategic outcomes. When criticism comes, they evaluate it objectively for useful insights while remaining emotionally unaffected by the disapproval itself. Such a person becomes impossible to manipulate through conventional social pressures, because the conventional pressure points simply don't exist. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, nor does it come without cost. The process of detachment requires us to confront some of our deepest fears about isolation, rejection, and loss. It demands that we build internal sources of validation to replace the external ones we're releasing. It forces us to develop genuine self-knowledge and self-acceptance, because we can no longer rely on others to tell us who we are or what we're worth. But the rewards of this inner work extend far beyond mere invulnerability to manipulation. When we no longer need specific outcomes to feel whole, we can pursue our goals with a clarity and persistence that attachment makes impossible. The entrepreneur who isn't emotionally invested in any particular business idea can pivot quickly when market conditions change, while their attached competitor clings to a failing strategy out of ego investment. The leader who doesn't need to be liked can make difficult but necessary decisions, while their people-pleasing counterpart compromises long-term success for short-term harmony. Perhaps most importantly, detachment creates space for authentic choice. When we're not driven by unconscious needs for approval, security, or identity validation, we can select our actions based on our genuine values and long-term strategic thinking. We become the authors of our own experience rather than reactive characters in dramas orchestrated by others. The detached person doesn't love less or care less about outcomes, they love more wisely and care more strategically. They can form deeper relationships because they're not relating from neediness. They can pursue ambitious goals because they're not paralyzed by the fear of failure. They can take principled stands because they don't require others to agree with them to feel secure in their position. This is the first great lesson of Machiavellian power. True strength comes not from what you can force others to do, but from what others cannot force you to feel. The person who has mastered their own emotional reactions and dissolved their dependencies has achieved a form of sovereignty that no external authority can revoke. They have become, in the deepest sense, free. But freedom, as Machiavelli understood, is only the foundation of power. Once liberated from the need to react to external circumstances, once detached from the outcomes that previously controlled their internal state, the individual faces a new challenge: what to do with this hard-won independence. The answer lies in the systematic destruction of everything within themselves that remains weak, needy, or compromised, a process of internal revolution that transforms not just how they relate to the world, but who they fundamentally are. Part 2: The Destruction of the Weak Self. The morning Machiavelli began writing The Prince, he understood that he was not merely documenting observations about political power, he was excavating the deeper principles that govern all human influence and control. But there was a secret embedded within his analysis that he could not state directly. In an age of political censorship and religious authority, the most crucial battle for power is not fought in the external world of politics and relationships, but in the internal landscape of the self. Every person carries within them multiple selves: the confident self and the insecure self, the principled self and the compromising self, the strategic self and the reactive self, the authentic self and the performative self. These different aspects of personality are not merely psychological curiosities, they represent competing power centers within our own consciousness, each with different values, different goals, and different approaches to navigating the world. The weak self seeks safety, approval, and comfort. The powerful self seeks truth, growth, and genuine effectiveness. The tragedy of most lives is that these internal selves are allowed to coexist, creating a constant state of inner conflict that severely compromises our external effectiveness. We make a decision from our strategic self, then undermine it with actions driven by our insecure self. We set boundaries from our principled self, then violate them under pressure from our approval-seeking self. We pursue ambitious goals with our confident self, then sabotage our own progress when our fearful self takes control. This internal inconsistency doesn't just create personal suffering, it creates profound vulnerability to external manipulation. Others quickly learn to identify which self is dominant in different situations and tailor their approach accordingly. They offer approval to activate our people-pleasing self when they want compliance. They threaten security to trigger our fearful self when they want submission. They appeal to our ego to engage our grandiose self when they want reckless commitment. As long as these various selves coexist within us, we remain predictable and controllable. Machiavelli's radical insight was that true power requires the systematic identification and elimination of every aspect of the self that operates from weakness, fear, or unconscious need. This is not about suppressing or denying these aspects. Suppression merely drives them underground where they continue to influence our behavior in hidden ways. Instead, it's about consciously examining each weak self, understanding the function it has served, and then deliberately choosing to starve it of the attention and energy it needs to survive. The process begins with developing what might be called the observer self, a part of consciousness that can watch our own thoughts, emotions, and reactions without being consumed by them. This observer notices when the insecure self starts seeking validation through others' opinions. It recognizes when the fearful self begins avoiding necessary risks. It identifies when the people-pleasing self starts compromising our values to maintain harmony. Rather than being unconsciously driven by these impulses, the observer creates space to examine them objectively. Once we can observe these internal patterns clearly, we can begin the work of conscious transformation. Every time the insecure self reaches for external validation, we can choose instead to generate internal validation by acknowledging our own competence and worth. Every time the fearful self tries to avoid necessary action, we can choose to act despite the fear, gradually proving to ourselves that we're more capable than our anxiety believes. Every time the people-pleasing self wants to compromise our boundaries, we can choose to maintain our standards regardless of others' reactions. This process is fundamentally different from willpower or positive thinking, because it operates at the level of identity rather than behavior. We're not trying to force ourselves to act differently while remaining internally the same. Instead, we're actually becoming a different person, one whose natural, effortless responses align with strength rather than weakness. Consider the transformation of the people-pleasing self. The person trapped in people-pleasing doesn't simply need to learn to say no more often. They need to fundamentally restructure their relationship to other people's approval. This means examining the underlying beliefs that make approval feel necessary. I'm only valuable if others like me. Conflict is dangerous and must be avoided. Other people's needs are more important than my own. Each of these beliefs represents a pillar supporting the weak self's dominance. The destruction of the people-pleasing self requires methodical demolition of these supporting beliefs through both intellectual analysis and experiential evidence. Intellectually, we can examine the logical flaws in believing that our worth depends on others' opinions, recognizing that others' judgments are based on incomplete information, personal biases, and their own psychological needs rather than objective assessment of our value. Experientially, we can deliberately engage in actions that risk disapproval while observing that our core self remains intact regardless of others' reactions. As these experiences accumulate, something remarkable happens. The people-pleasing self literally dies from lack of sustenance. Without constant validation of its core beliefs, without repeated experiences that seem to prove its worldview correct, this aspect of personality simply fades away. What remains is a self that genuinely doesn't need others' approval to feel whole, not because it has learned to suppress that need, but because the part of us that had that need no longer exists. The same process applies to every form of internal weakness. The insecure self dies when we stop feeding it with self-doubt and start nourishing ourselves with accurate self-assessment. The victim self dies when we stop focusing on how circumstances have wronged us and start focusing on how we can respond effectively. The entitled self dies when we stop expecting the world to accommodate our preferences and start taking complete responsibility for our results. This internal destruction is necessarily uncomfortable, because we're literally killing off parts of ourselves that have been with us for years or decades. These weak selves often developed as protective mechanisms during childhood or traumatic experiences, so there can be a sense of grief or loss as we release them. The insecure self might have protected us from disappointment by keeping our expectations low. The people-pleasing self might have helped us avoid conflict in a chaotic family environment. The victim self might have helped us make sense of experiences that seemed otherwise inexplicable. But here's what Machiavelli understood that most people miss: holding on to these protective selves beyond their usefulness doesn't actually protect us, it guarantees our continued vulnerability. The insecure self that once protected us from disappointment now prevents us from pursuing opportunities that could transform our lives. The people-pleasing self that once helped us avoid family conflict now makes us ineffective leaders and unreliable partners. The victim self that once helped us process trauma now keeps us trapped in patterns of powerlessness. The destruction of the weak self is ultimately an act of self-love, because it liberates our authentic power and allows us to engage with the world from strength rather than fear. But this transformation requires a quality that few people possess: the willingness to be completely honest about their own weaknesses and limitations. Most people protect their weak selves through elaborate systems of rationalization and self-deception. They tell themselves they're not people pleasers, they're just considerate. They convince themselves they're not avoiding risk, they're being prudent. They frame their attachment to others' opinions as caring about relationships. These rationalizations prevent the honest self-examination that transformation requires. The person committed to destroying their weak self approaches this inventory with the ruthless honesty of a surgeon examining diseased tissue. They don't seek to justify or explain their weaknesses, they simply identify them clearly so they can be addressed effectively. This requires setting aside the ego's need to maintain a positive self-image in favor of the soul's need for authentic development. As the weak selves are systematically identified and dissolved, something extraordinary emerges: a core self that is naturally powerful, naturally authentic, and naturally effective. This isn't a self we create through effort, it's a self we uncover by removing everything that isn't genuinely us. Like Michelangelo describing his sculptures as already existing within the marble, requiring only the removal of excess stone to reveal them, our powerful self already exists within us, waiting to be liberated from the accumulated layers of fear, conditioning, and protective mechanisms. This liberated self operates from fundamentally different principles than the weak selves it has replaced. Where the weak selves operated from need, the powerful self operates from choice. Where the weak selves reacted to circumstances, the powerful self responds from values. Where the weak selves sought to avoid pain, the powerful self seeks to create value. Where the weak selves try to control others' behavior, the powerful self focuses on maximizing its own effectiveness. The person who has completed this internal transformation becomes genuinely dangerous to systems and people that depend on others' weakness for their own power. They can't be manipulated through guilt because they have no unconscious guilt to exploit. They can't be controlled through fear because they've made peace with all the outcomes they previously dreaded. They can't be bought because they've learned to generate internal satisfaction rather than seeking it through external acquisitions. But, perhaps most importantly, they become impossible to destroy through external means because they've already destroyed everything within themselves that was genuinely destructible. The weak, needy, fearful parts of their personality that once provided targets for others' attacks simply no longer exist. What remains is a self that can adapt to any circumstance, learn from any setback, and continue moving toward its chosen objectives regardless of external opposition or support. This internal invulnerability, then, becomes the foundation for external influence that operates through attraction rather than manipulation, through demonstrated value rather than applied pressure, through authentic power rather than borrowed authority. But, to understand how this transformation translates into practical effectiveness in the world, we must examine the final stage of the Machiavellian journey, the emergence of unshakable power. Part 3, The Emergence of Unshakable Power. On the evening before completing The Prince, Machiavelli sat in his study reviewing the manuscript that would eventually reshape humanity's understanding of power. As candlelight flickered across the pages documenting his observations of rulers, conquerors, and political survivors, he recognized that he had uncovered something more profound than a manual for political success. He had identified the fundamental mechanics of human influence, principles that operated at every level of existence, from the most intimate personal relationships to the grandest geopolitical strategies. But there was one insight that emerged from his analysis that he could not write explicitly in that dangerous time: the ultimate form of power is not the ability to force others to do what you want, but the capacity to remain completely yourself regardless of what others do. True power is not about control, it's about freedom. And the highest freedom is liberation from the need to control anything outside yourself to feel secure, worthy, or successful. When a person has systematically detached from external validation and destroyed their internal weakness, they undergo a transformation that fundamentally alters their relationship to power itself. They no longer seek power to compensate for feelings of inadequacy or to prove their worth to others. Instead, they express power naturally, like a river flowing to the sea, because they have removed all the internal obstacles that previously blocked their authentic effectiveness. This transformation manifests in several distinct characteristics that make such individuals virtually impossible to defeat or diminish through conventional means. First, they become strategically unpredictable, because they're no longer driven by the unconscious needs and fears that make most people's behavior easily foreseeable. The executive who desperately needs approval will consistently choose popular options over optimal ones. The person afraid of confrontation will reliably back down when pressured. The individual attached to their image will predictably make decisions that protect their reputation rather than advance their objectives. But, the person who has achieved genuine detachment operates from a completely different decision-making matrix. They evaluate options based purely on effectiveness toward their chosen goals, without the distorting influence of ego, fear, or unconscious need. This makes them strategically dangerous, because opponents can't predict their moves using the psychological levers that typically govern human behavior. They might choose an unpopular strategy because it's effective, engage in confrontation because it's necessary, or sacrifice their reputation because it serves a larger purpose. Second, they develop what might be called anti-fragile confidence, a form of self-assurance that actually grows stronger under pressure rather than weakening. Traditional confidence is often brittle, dependent on continued success and positive feedback to maintain itself. When challenged or criticized, it becomes defensive and seeks to protect itself through various forms of resistance or retaliation. But the confidence that emerges from internal transformation is fundamentally different, because it's based on genuine self-knowledge rather than external validation. The person with anti-fragile confidence welcomes criticism because they understand it might contain useful information. They're curious rather than defensive when their methods are questioned, because they're more committed to effectiveness than to being right. They can acknowledge mistakes without experiencing shame, because they don't identify their self-worth with their performance. This creates a feedback loop that continuously improves their actual competence while simultaneously making them more resistant to the psychological warfare that typically accompanies high-level competition. Third, they develop authentic charisma that operates through attraction rather than manipulation. Most people trying to influence others do so through various forms of pressure, logical arguments designed to overcome resistance, emotional appeals intended to trigger desired responses, or social dynamics that create obligation or compliance. These approaches often work in the short term, but they create underlying resentment and resistance that eventually undermines the relationship. The person who has achieved internal transformation influences others through a completely different mechanism. They become someone that others naturally want to follow, support, or emulate. This isn't because they've learned better persuasion techniques, but because they've become genuinely powerful in ways that others can sense intuitively. People are drawn to authentic confidence the same way they're drawn to authentic talent, not because they're being manipulated, but because they recognize something real and valuable. This authentic influence is infinitely more sustainable than influence based on manipulation or pressure, because it doesn't require constant effort to maintain. The manipulative leader must continuously work to manage others' perceptions, control information flow, and prevent their true nature from being discovered. The authentically powerful person simply needs to remain themselves, because their natural way of being is what creates their influence. Fourth, they develop strategic patience that allows them to operate on longer time horizons than their competition. Most people are driven by unconscious urgency created by their unresolved needs and fears. The person who needs approval acts quickly to secure validation. The person afraid of loss makes hasty decisions to prevent potential threats. The person attached to specific outcomes rushes toward their goals in ways that often sabotage their own success. But the individual who has achieved detachment and destroyed their weak selves can operate with the patience of geological time. They understand that true power accumulates gradually through consistent application of correct principles rather than through dramatic gestures or urgent actions. They can wait for optimal opportunities rather than forcing suboptimal situations. They can invest in relationships and capabilities that may not pay off for years, because they're not driven by immediate ego needs. This strategic patience creates enormous advantages in negotiation, relationship building, and long-term planning. While others are reacting to immediate pressures or chasing short-term gains, the powerful person is positioning themselves for outcomes that may not materialize for months or years. By the time others recognize what's happening, the strategic positioning is complete and the outcome is virtually inevitable. Fifth, they develop what philosophers call a more fatty love of fate, or the ability to not just accept but actually embrace whatever circumstances arise. This isn't passive resignation or spiritual bypassing, but active appreciation for the fact that every situation, regardless of how initially unpleasant or challenging, contains opportunities for growth, learning, or strategic advantage. The person who has truly mastered this principle becomes literally unstoppable, because they've eliminated the possibility of defeat at the psychological level. Every setback becomes a setup for a greater comeback. Every attack from opponents becomes an opportunity to demonstrate their own strength and their attacker's weakness. Every loss becomes a chance to practice detachment and build anti-fragile resilience. This psychological invulnerability then translates into practical invulnerability, because they no longer provide their opponents with the emotional reactions that psychological warfare requires. You cannot demoralize someone who finds opportunity in every setback. You cannot intimidate someone who has made peace with all possible outcomes. You cannot manipulate someone who doesn't need anything from you to feel complete. The emergence of this level of personal power creates a profound shift in how the individual relates to traditional power structures and authority figures. They no longer need permission from others to act according to their values. They don't require approval from institutions to feel confident in their choices. They stop seeking validation from authority figures and start evaluating all authority claims based on merit rather than position. This doesn't make them rebellious or disrespectful toward legitimate authority, quite the opposite. Because they're not reacting from unconscious resentment or need, they can accurately assess when authority is being exercised competently and when it deserves support. They become valuable allies to effective leaders and natural opponents to those who abuse their positions. In their professional lives, such individuals often become what organizational psychologists call high performers with high autonomy, people who consistently deliver exceptional results while requiring minimal supervision or external motivation. They set their own standards higher than any external authority would dare impose. They seek feedback not because they need approval, but because they're committed to continuous improvement. They take responsibility for outcomes that go far beyond their formal job descriptions, because they understand that their own effectiveness is the most reliable foundation for their security and advancement. In their personal relationships, they become what might be called autonomous partners, people who choose to connect with others from strength rather than need. They don't seek relationships to fill internal voids or to avoid loneliness. Instead, they share their already complete selves with others who are doing the same. This creates partnerships based on mutual enhancement rather than mutual dependence, leading to deeper intimacy and stronger connections than need-based relationships can ever achieve. Perhaps most remarkably, they develop an intuitive understanding of power dynamics that allows them to navigate complex social and professional environments with extraordinary effectiveness. Because they've mastered their own internal power dynamics, they can easily recognize and respond to the power dynamics operating around them. They see through manipulation attempts immediately, not because they're cynical, but because they understand the psychological mechanics that manipulation requires. They can identify genuine authority and expertise quickly, because they're not distracted by their own projections or unconscious reactions. The person who has completed this transformation often finds that traditional concepts of success become almost irrelevant. They're no longer chasing external markers of achievement to prove their worth to themselves or others. Instead, they operate from intrinsic motivation toward goals that align with their authentic values and interests. This often leads to extraordinary external success, but success that feels natural and sustainable rather than forced or anxiety-provoking. Their relationship with money, status, and recognition transforms completely. These things become tools rather than goals, useful when they serve larger purposes but not needed for psychological completion. They can pursue wealth without greed, seek recognition without neediness, and accumulate status without attachment. This psychological freedom allows them to take the kinds of risks and make the kinds of investments that create genuine prosperity rather than merely accumulating security blankets. most importantly, they become what philosophers and spiritual teachers have called complete or whole human beings, individuals who have integrated all aspects of themselves into a coherent, powerful, and authentic expression of their deepest nature. They no longer experience internal conflict between different parts of themselves because they've eliminated the parts that operated from weakness or fear. What remains is a unified self that can respond to any situation from wisdom, strength, and genuine care for optimal outcomes. This wholeness is perhaps the most attractive and influential quality a human being can develop, because others can sense intuitively when they're in the presence of someone who has achieved integration. Such individuals naturally become centers of gravity in their social and professional environments, not because they seek attention or try to dominate, but because their presence carries a quality of groundedness and authenticity that others find deeply appealing and trustworthy. The final stage of this transformation is the recognition that true power is ultimately impersonal. It operates through the individual rather than belonging to them. The person who has achieved genuine mastery becomes a clear channel for wisdom, effectiveness, and positive influence to flow into the world. They understand that their role is not to hoard power for personal advantage, but to embody and express it in service of something larger than themselves. This transition from personal power to transpersonal service marks the completion of the Machiavellian journey. The individual who began by seeking to protect themselves from external manipulation ends by becoming a source of strength and guidance for others. They achieve the ultimate form of security not through controlling their environment, but through becoming valuable enough that their environment naturally supports and protects them. In the end, Machiavelli's deepest insight was not about political strategy or social manipulation, but about human potential. He recognized that within every person lies the capacity for extraordinary power, effectiveness, and influence. But accessing this capacity requires the courage to examine our weaknesses honestly, the discipline to eliminate what doesn't serve our highest good, and the wisdom to understand that true strength comes not from what we can take from the world, but from what we can give to it. The person who completes this transformation becomes truly undestroyable, not because they're protected by external defenses, but because they've eliminated everything within themselves that could be destroyed. What remains is pure potential, expressed through authentic action, guided by wisdom, and offered in service to the highest good they can envision. This is the ultimate expression of power, not power over others, but power as others, power with others, and power for the benefit of all. Such individuals become living examples of human possibility, demonstrations of what becomes available when we stop limiting ourselves through unconscious fears and begin expressing our authentic nature without compromise. They show us that the choice between power and love, between effectiveness and integrity, between success and authenticity is a false choice, that true mastery integrates all of these qualities into a seamless expression of human excellence. This is the gift that Machiavelli ultimately offers to anyone willing to undertake the challenging but transformative work of becoming who they really are, the recognition that the power we seek in the external world already exists within us, waiting to be liberated through the systematic dismantling of everything that keeps it hidden. The man who destroys his weak self truly can never be destroyed by others, because he has become indestructible at the level of identity itself, not through building stronger defenses, but through becoming someone who no longer needs to defend anything at all.